Since we are the Responsible Logistics podcast, I would also like to discuss a little bit more specifically the logistics sector. So I think that in logistics, we pay also quite a lot of attention to E aspect of ESG. But how do you think logistics companies can also implement the S and G parts?
Okay, here's one thing that I'm quite interested in. So I'm not an expert in logistics, so I don't want to, lead your audience to think I'm some sort of expert in logistics, but I do know a little about different kinds of transportable energy. So you're Gerteka, you're a logistics company, and you realize and you have a commitment to reduce your reliance on fossil fuels in your vehicles, right? Okay, so there are associated risks with doing that though, and we call these transition risks. In other words, what are the risks that a company may face or might encounter when they transition from, fossil fuel to other sources of energy? So a logistics company, whether you're doing freight, whether you're doing shipping, it applies to anyone who uses a vehicle to transport goods. Right now, there are a couple alternatives for you. The one is EVs, so electric vehicles, right? But there are some risks with maybe over-investing in completely transforming your fleet to only EVs. Well, one of them is right now, the Americans, but also the European Union are considering tariffs on Chinese batteries and electric vehicles to protect our own industries. Meanwhile, China pretty much dominates the supply of some of the major rare earth metals that are required to build batteries. So think of that risk, right? I mean, of course, you get a new EV fleet and suddenly the price of batteries or the availability of batteries starts going up. Okay, so then the other alternative would be, say, hydrogen. And there's different kinds of hydrogen or ways to produce hydrogen. So there's your gray hydrogen, there's your blue hydrogen, which is, you use natural gas to electrolyze water to, separate H2. And then you capture, right, the carbon emissions from that natural gas. So that's called blue. And then there's green, which is using renewable energy to electrolyze water. And so that's the cleanest, right? There's very few emissions. So, of course, there's lots of different initiatives and engineering challenges, but it looks like we could and have and will run vehicles on hydrogen. Okay, but there's certain risks to that too, right? What if the available of green hydrogen doesn't turn out to be as available as a less clean version? So what do you do as a logistics company? Do you go all in on EVs? Do you go all in on hydrogen? Do you kind of hedge your bets and do a bit of both? And you can see that this is a very complicated kind of scenario to determining what the future path of your entire fleet is. And it's dependent on things other than you. Supply issues, cost of certain materials. EU regulatory environment is a really big one. The EU may sort of tip the scale toward EVs, or it might tip the scale towards hydrogen, not to mention, the other major players like the Americans, not to mention investors. Maybe they'll take a shining to one over the other. So you can see these transition risks, logistics companies are very aware of, and there's no easy path. So they have to consider all these risks, but also the opportunities are huge as well.
So basically CSRD is meant for reporting and its main focus is on reporting, but are there any other EU tools that regulate the current business landscape?
Yeah, I mean, that's only one, it's not a small component, but it's only one sort of component or pillar of the green, the European Green Deal, which is a massive effort to kind of transition our entire economy by 2050 to more sustainability. So that covers, the CSRD is really meant to discuss the transparency, right? But I've been talking about investors a lot, right? And risk. So let me maybe talk about some of the instruments that the EU has devised to influence the flow of investment funds, both public and private, into those activities that are sustainable. Because of course, I mean, a lot of these new technologies, companies that want to scale up their sustainability efforts need investment, right? And so the EU has devised a couple of things for that. So one of the big ones is called the EU Taxonomy. Taxonomy is an awkward word again, but all it really means is they've come up with a classification system to determine whether certain economic activities are sustainable, right? So for example, in real estate, right? If, let's say, you're demolishing a building, the EU has created a taxonomy or criteria for that economic activity that if the contractors or if the company that's performing that sticks with and is aligned with, then they can be called sustainable. So if I'm an investor, if I'm a bank and I'm looking to divest of my brown investments and start bolstering my green investments, well, then that's something I'll look for, right? Have they basically, how much of their activities are aligned with the EU taxonomy? So this is it's sort of a quiet one. Not too many people in the general public know about it, but I think this is going to become increasingly important because it really is very probable that this will start directing investment funds to more sustainable companies. So that's an interesting one. Another one that has to do with investment is called the SFDR. Again, I'm so sorry about the acronyms. I didn't make them. So this one's called the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. Yeah?
Okay.
And so if I'm an investment fund, for example, and I want to say, hey, this fund I have is a green fund. And a lot of investment funds used to do this, and they weren't always sustainable and they weren't always green. So the EU has come up with, again, criteria by which you can properly say that it's a green fund. And there's different articles. So, one of the funds is the whole idea of the fund is to be sustainable. Another article or another type of fund is one that sort of furthers the goals, but its primary intent, isn't to be green. So as you can see, there's a lot of focus, and it's not getting as much attention as, say, the CSRD in reporting, but there is a lot going on when it comes to investment and companies who want to scale up, companies who want to grow, companies who need loans and financing will, I think, start looking at these instruments and aligning with them so it makes them attractive to investors. So then there's also the Green Claims Directive. And as you can imagine, a lot of companies are trying to market their products to be green because there's a growing market, particularly among young people, right? So they care quite a lot about sustainability. They want to do the right thing. They want to buy sustainable products. But up until recently, there's really been no legal requirements for what a company can claim. And the EU did a large study a couple years ago, and they found that, I can't remember the exact percentage, but around 50% of green claims by companies, so my product is green, for example, were untrue or unfounded or unverifiable, meaning they had no data to prove it. And this is a problem, right? I mean, if companies are allowed to say they're green and consumers start buying them because of that, there's two issues. One, it's consumer protection, 101. You don't want to be allowing companies to mislead the public. And second, well, if they can sell their product and claim they're green without actually being green, then that doesn't help our environment in any way whatsoever. So for those two reasons, the EU devised the Green Claims Directive. And effectively what it does is it's meant to prevent this kind of greenwashing by companies. And there's quite a big penalty to it, at least in the law. There's a 4% penalty that can be applied to companies who are accused of this greenwashing. And rightfully, it's proven that they've greenwashed, and it's 4% of revenue. So not 4% of profit, but 4% of revenue, exactly. It may be like the GDPR, where, the fines...
I wanted to say it's the same kind of...
Yeah. It's like the GDPR in the sense that in terms of penalties, I don't think they're going to immediately start slapping 4%
So 4%
fines.
of the revenue of the company.
Is the maximum amount the EU could penalize a company. So like GDPR, they won't do that at the beginning, but GDPR penalties are very big now, even though they weren't at first.
Yeah.
So this is another thing coming down the line that people in communications or marketing or advertising need to be very aware of. And legal departments are, of course, sort of starting to advise their marketing staff.
To be careful.
Yeah.
But let's actually discuss greenwashing. What is it?
Okay, so greenwashing is when you make a false claim or want to appear to be green without actually being green. So it's giving or creating the false impression through advertising and marketing, right? I mean, I can give you a very famous example of greenwashing that also shows that it's not as clear-cut as one might think. So, okay, so there's a big Danish pork producer called Danish Crown, and I teach this to my students. It's a really interesting case study. And there was the CEO of Velour was really, I think, genuinely wanting to make pork production greener. And he made all sorts of, innovations to use less pollutants, less water, less fertilizer in the feed, right? And so he made real gains, I think. However, those gains, of course, cost him a little bit more money. That required costs. And so, how do you make up for those costs? Well, you have to pass those on to the consumers in terms of higher price. Okay, so now imagine you're selling in Poland or in Britain or in Germany, and now you've got two different pork products on the shelves. One is more expensive, and the other one is cheaper. And if you're a price-sensitive consumer, you just pick the cheaper one, right? Unless you can market or advertise that the more expensive one is more expensive because it's more sustainable. Exactly, and so you've got to kind of, create a value proposition to your customer if your price point is higher. So he basically did that, and he said it was a climate-controlled pig, which is really catchy, right? Climate-controlled pig. However, what happened is that Greenpeace was quite angry about this and said, no pork can be climate friendly or all the rest of it, accused them of greenwashing. It went to court, and there was a big penalty. And that's tough, right? Because effectively what's happening is that I think the CEO was genuine. He had to somehow market, his sustainability efforts to be able to differentiate from cheaper competitors, and yet it actually got him in trouble.
Right.
So this is another reason why greenwashing, like the Green Claims Directive, is good, because it basically says what you can say and what you can't. And if that was clear for him, he wouldn't have said that in the first place, and they would have come up with something else. And effectively, what cases like this show, or what they're kind of, what they're incentivizing, is not greenwashing, but greenhushing. In other words, some companies, even though they're making sustainability efforts, aren't much talking about it because they're afraid that Greenpeace or another NGO will come after them for greenwashing.
Right.
So again, the Green Claims Directive is trying to level the playing field, trying to make people feel comfortable about what they can and can't say. And this will be good because those companies that are making those efforts can now advertise them, and they know the rules to do that. And it will also just prevent greenwashing from companies that really aren't making these sustainability efforts. So this is a great move, I think, this Green Claims Directive.
So all of what we just discussed seems pretty scary in terms of risks, but because I think that a lot of ESG conversation is basically around managing risks, but do you think that there are also some opportunities that come with it?
Yeah. I mean, you can even look at risk itself as an opportunity. In other words, if you identify your risks, then that avoids a lot of trouble. That's an opportunity, right, to avoid those pitfalls, number one. Two, if you do have a good risk assessment and you disclose that and communicate it to investors, for example, that may avail you of financing, right? So even just that risk assessment can be an opportunity in itself. But yeah, I mean, there are ways in which you can look at these ESG matters and discover that there are opportunities there if you do the right thing. So I think a good example is, let's say, the gender pay gap, right? So, as you know, in many countries throughout Europe, well, in all countries throughout Europe, there's still a gender pay gap. And of course, there's a new law that's out. In Lithuania, it's here. And the CSRD is effectively telling companies they should report this too. So what's the gender pay gap in your organization, right? What's the ratio of women to men employees? Now, by disclosing this, imagine if it's really bad, right? Imagine if the gender pay gap, the equal pay for equal work is quite off. So women are getting paid 30% on average, less than men for doing the same job. Okay, so there's a risk there, number one. And the risk is, there's a lot of young women graduates coming up. They'll be very talented, they'll be very motivated and ambitious. Now, if they look at a company and the company has disclosed that there's that big an income or a gender pay gap, why would they want to go work for that company? They'll choose somewhere else. So you're losing out on talent, which can, of course, in the long run, hurt your productivity and worker satisfaction and all the rest of it. But there's also an opportunity there too. In other words, if you narrow that gap, even close the gap, well, that will become an attractive workplace for these young and talented, ambitious women. So I think you can look at almost all risks, and there's a flip side, and that's the opportunity. And so I would encourage any company doing these kind of risk assessments to also, risks are sometimes easier to conceive, but often just give it a little more thought, flip it, and you'll see an opportunity there too, which can give you a competitive edge.
Interesting. Basically, look from another angle to the same issue.
Yeah.
Another question I have is related to a more technical side of ESG, because I hear quite a lot about scopes 1, 2, and 3, but I think many people misunderstand it or don't understand it at all. So maybe you could explain a little bit what is it and why should companies care about it or keep it in mind?
Okay, that's a good question. A lot of people are confused or find this a difficult thing, especially scope 3. So the way I like to think of it is scope 1 are basically your direct emissions. So if it's a logistics company, what are the greenhouse gas emissions from your fleet, right, in the transport? Okay, then there's scope 2, and those are the emissions that are caused by the power you need to operate. So a building, a factory, a warehouse, that will need energy for electricity or heat. And so that's obviously probably greenhouse gas emissions. And then the scope 3, which is the tricky one. And those are emissions that are emitted because of you. In other words, all the supplies and the equipment and the parts, and you can imagine there's a wide variety of that. What greenhouse gas emissions were produced into those, because ultimately those are because of you, right? You purchased them. They might not have been manufactured otherwise, right? So scope 3 is the big challenge. Scope 1 and 2 are relatively easy to calculate. Yeah, exactly. And a lot of governments have even provided simple calculators for companies to use. But yeah, scope 3 is the challenge because I guess if you wanted to do it in the technically correct way, you would have to go to every single supplier and get those numbers from them, and that's virtually impossible at the moment. Now, there are kind of rules of thumb or shortcuts that people use to do scope 3, but of course those can be inaccurate, although it's sometimes the best we have now. Also, of course, some people are including it in their supplier contracts. So if you have a supplier code of conduct, you can request that information from them, which helps collect it.
So it becomes supplier's obligation, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. And so you're basically wanting that information from your suppliers so you yourself can sort of calculate your scope 3. Yeah. But it's important, even though it's really difficult, scope 3 matters because, like I said, it is typically the largest part of a company's emissions. And obviously we want to start, as a company, you want to start reducing your scope 3, but you can't unless you know what those figures are. So it is very important, although it is a challenge to report accurately.
So for those companies that are just starting out with their sustainability journey, do you have any specific piece of advice where they could start, or what would be their initial steps?
Yeah, I guess the first step would be just compliance. So, are you in scope of the CSRD? You might not be, but if you are, that's something to get on top of. Maybe you want to look at the Claims Directive and you want to sort of do an audit of your advertisements and all the rest of it. There's others we didn't mention, right? Like the CSDDD, with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive.
So triple D.
Triple D. Does that apply to you, right? The EU Taxonomy, would that be useful for you to start, evaluating the eligibility and alignment of your economic activities? Are you doing economic activities that are included in the taxonomy, right? So I think the first thing is just to get a sense of the regulatory landscape, the different instruments, and see, do they apply to me? Can they help me or not? But that's mainly compliance, right? But it's my experience that as companies start complying, there's a lot more than just writing the numbers down on a spreadsheet, right? There's actually a process by which companies find out the material topics they have. They're, as I mentioned before, you evaluate your impacts in a certain way. So you have a nice long list of all the potential impacts, and you start saying, okay, well, that one is or that one isn't, and you prioritize them. And then there's another big discussion about risks, and you list a whole bunch of them and say, okay, well, that one's not too likely, or the magnitude is very small, but that one's big. And those are part and parcel of complying with the CSRD. So you see, like, if they apply to you and you have to comply, then if you follow their instructions, you actually start going through the sustainability process as it, I think, should be. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you'll get a lot longer, a lot further on your journey without even expecting to, just by finding out, am I in scope? Do these apply to me? And then embarking on the process itself.
Right. So speaking about the upcoming few years, what do you think would be the trends that will dominate the sustainability landscape, or like ESG landscape?
I think, well, in terms of the regulations and the instruments, remember, a lot of these haven't really been started and been undergone yet, right? So a lot of companies don't have to do the ESRS reporting or CSRD reporting for another year or two, right? Mm-hmm. Some of these are just directives and they're not transposed into law. We have a new European Parliament, and some points suggest that they're going to try consolidating some of these different instruments. So the one thing I think is important is keep an eye on these regulations, keep an eye on these directives, keep an eye on your competitors or other people in your sector and see what they're doing. Because there will be a lot of, as we implement these things, there will be a lot of best case examples, worst case examples, best practices emerging. And that, I think, is probably the most important thing to consider at the moment. But second, risk. I mean, there's a lot of investment and a lot of financing available that's going to become available as well. And companies don't want to be left out of that. So look at those regulations beyond reporting that are about, doing risk assessments and looking for opportunities and disclosing those, because that, I think, will bring significant benefits over the next few years.
And do you think technologies like AI will affect it in any way?
Well, I think we have to be careful with some of the false promises of AI. In my own experience of reporting and going through the sustainability strategy, this requires, locking yourself in a room with several people who know what they're talking about in the company and know the operations and see the big picture and the little picture, and just discussing. AI can't replace that. It just can't, right? It may be able to help you prepare a sustainability report, but I think most people who have any familiarity with AI, particularly like, say, ChatGPT and other models, large language models, it makes mistakes, it has hallucinations, it's not so good at arithmetic, actually. So there's always going to need to be kind of human oversight of any AI applications. That's important too. And AI itself is, I would consider, to be a sustainability risk or opportunity or impact. AI, requires particularly these large language models that use or require brute force to train. that's using a lot of resources like water to cool the servers, right? A lot of high energy demands. And that may become, if a company is a technology company with a lot of AI usage, that may be considered one of their major impacts, right? That could also start being a major risk or opportunity for AI-dependent companies as well.
Right.
So I see AI both being offered as sort of a service or facilitator of the reporting, and that maybe it'll be great, maybe it won't, that remains to be seen. But I also see AI as an ESG risk and opportunity and impact in and of itself. And so I think companies should be looking at their implementation of AI in that ESG mindset.
So Jonathan, since we're coming to an end of the episode, I have a couple of final questions for you. One of them is, what's one thing listeners could do today to contribute to a more sustainable future?
I hope this doesn't sound cheesy, but actually what they're doing right now, just listening to a podcast about sustainability. I mean, knowledge is basically the start of any sustainability journey, and becoming educated, becoming interested, becoming curious is really the first step. If you're not aware of the issues, if you're not aware of the problems, if you're not aware of the opportunities, how could you do anything to be part of the solution? So honestly, really, I tell my students this too, but also an executive, just read, just listen, just watch, and try to educate yourself. And there's plenty of resources out there. Yeah.
And it can be quite fun as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
And my final question would be, is there any specific message that you would like to share with our listeners? Perhaps something we didn't cover?
Yeah, I think people need to be more aware that sustainability and ESG is not strictly about impacts. It's about changes are coming in our environment, in our societies, and as companies, as individuals, as communities, as a continent like the EU, we want to be resilient to these challenges. We want our companies to survive 20, 50, 100 years into the future. And to do that, we're going to start really needing to consider the different risks and opportunities that these global challenges are presenting. So that would be my message. Don't merely think about your impacts, also think about insuring your house.
That's great.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, Jonathan, for joining us today, for finding time.
My pleasure.
I would also like to thank our listeners for joining us for today's episode. If you would like to learn more about sustainability, please visit our website and follow us on social media. I'll see you next time.